I remember that evening like it was yesterday. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the air felt thick, almost warning me to stay alert. I had just settled in with my cup of tea when a strange sound echoed from the front porch, the sound of paper being slipped under my door. Curious, I got up slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath my tired feet. I bent down, picked up the folded note, and saw trembling handwriting across the front. "Get out of here if you want to live." At first I laughed nervously. Who would send something so dramatic? My neighbor, old Mrs. Henderson, was always watching too many mystery shows. Maybe it was one of her pranks again, but something about the shaky letters made my stomach twist. I stepped outside and looked toward her house. Her curtains were drawn tight, the lights off, but her car was still in the driveway. I waved, hoping she'd come out and explain, but the silence that answered me was thick, unnerving. 10 minutes later, everything changed. I heard it, a loud crash, then the faint smell of gas in the air. The ground trembled beneath me, and in the distance a low rumble began to rise. I looked toward Mrs. Henderson's house, and that's when I saw its smoke curling from her kitchen window, the flames beginning to dance like demons in the night. Without thinking, I ran toward her door. "Mrs. Henderson," I shouted, pounding on it with all my strength. "It's Auntie Mae, are you in there?" But before I could take another step, a second explosion tore through the front of her house, throwing me backward into the grass. My ears rang, my heart raced, and all I could see was fire and flying debris. When I woke up, my neighbor's home was gone, reduced to rubble and ash. The firefighters told me later that it had been a gas leak, one that could have taken down both our homes if she hadn't noticed it first. They said she'd smelled the leak hours earlier and tried to warn everyone nearby. She'd even gone door to door, but I hadn't heard her knock. So she slipped that note under my door, her last desperate act before the explosion. Mrs. Henderson didn't make it out, but because of her warning I did. I still see her house every time I close my eyes, the place where laughter once lived, now an empty lot filled with memories. Sometimes I stand there and whisper, "Thank you," because even in her final moments she thought of others before herself. And that, my dear friends, is what being human truly means: to care, to act, even when fear and danger are at your doorstep. So if you ever feel an uneasy pull in your gut, if something inside whispers, "Leave," or "Move," listen. Sometimes that small voice is the only thing standing between life and loss. I learned that night that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they're quiet neighbors who write shaky words on a piece of paper and save your life. That evening began like any other, quiet and uneventful, the kind of night where the ticking clock seems louder than your own heartbeat. The wind outside hummed softly against the windowpanes, and the smell of chamomile tea filled my little living room. I had just sat down in my favorite chair, ready to lose myself in an old book, when I heard it, a faint rustle at the front door. It was so soft that at first I thought I imagined it. But then came another sound, a sharp slip, like paper brushing against wood. I frowned, setting my cup down. Nobody ever came to visit that late, not in our sleepy neighborhood. Still, curiosity got the best of me. I walked to the door and bent down, and there it was, an envelope lying on the doormat, its edges trembling slightly from the draft seeping in beneath the frame. There was no stamp, no name, no sign of who it was from. Just hurried, uneven handwriting scrawled across the front. "Get out of here if you want to live." For a moment I just stared at it. The words didn't seem real. I actually laughed under my breath. It had to be some sort of prank. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, loved her detective shows and always talked about secret messages and spy stories. I figured she was having a bit of fun. But when I looked closer, I saw how shaky the writing was, as if the hand that wrote it was trembling. Something about that sent a chill creeping down my spine. I opened the door and looked across the street toward her house. The porch light, which was always on, was dark. Her curtains were drawn tight, the way you do when you're afraid of something. Her car was still parked out front, but there wasn't a hint of movement inside. The air felt thick, heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I called her name softly, "Mrs. Henderson." My voice sounded too loud in the silence. Nothing answered but the distant rumble of thunder. I told myself not to be silly, that she was probably fine, maybe asleep or out back feeding her cats. Yet the longer I stood there, the more that note in my hand began to feel alive, almost pulsing with urgency. I went back inside, shut the door, and tried to laugh it off again. But every time I looked at those words, "Get out of here if you want to live," something deep in my chest tightened. The letters weren't just words anymore, they were a plea, a cry for attention. I thought about calling her, but her number was written in my old phone book in the kitchen drawer, and for some reason I hesitated. What if she thought I was overreacting? What if it was nothing? Minutes dragged by like hours. The house began to feel smaller, darker, quieter. I could hear every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the trees outside. My instincts whispered that something wasn't right. It wasn't fear exactly, it was awareness, that subtle stirring you feel when the world around you changes in ways you can't explain. I looked again at her house. I thought I saw a flicker of light behind the curtains, maybe a shadow moving quickly. I took a step toward the door, ready to go check on her, but some invisible hand of hesitation, stopped me. My grandmother used to say that sometimes, when danger is near, your spirit knows before your mind does. And right then, my spirit was screaming for me to wait. I sat back down, clutching the note in my hand like it might somehow tell me what to do. The words blurred a little as my eyes strung with worry. Was she trying to warn me about someone? Something? Why hadn't she come herself? I kept telling myself I'd go in just a few more minutes once I gathered my courage. The clock on the mantel struck 9. The sound echoed through the quiet house. I didn't know it then, but I had less than 10 minutes before everything I knew would change. Less than 10 minutes before fire and thunder tore through the stillness of our street. Less than 10 minutes before that strange, desperate note would reveal its terrible truth. And even as I sat there, heart beating too fast, I couldn't help but think of the shaky way she'd written those words. Whatever had driven her to put that paper under my door, it hadn't been madness, it had been fear. And in that moment I wished I had listened to that fear, because sometimes warnings don't come from nowhere. Sometimes they're the only thing standing between life and everything that's about to be lost. The air outside had grown strange that night. You know, that kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful but heavy, like the world is waiting for something to happen. That's how it felt when I stepped out onto the porch after reading that note. The sun had long gone, and the sky hung low with thick clouds that seemed to swallow every bit of moonlight. The street was empty. No cars passing, no dogs barking, no neighbors chatting on porches, just stillness. It was the kind of quiet that makes your heart beat louder than it should. I stood there for a while, the note clutched tight in my hand, looking across at Mrs. Henderson's house. Her curtains were drawn, every single one. That wasn't like her. Normally she kept the kitchen light on so her cats could see their food bowls by the window, but that night it was completely dark. Her flower pots were knocked over and her gate hung half open, swinging ever so slightly with the wind. I called her name once softly. Mrs. Henderson, but my voice just floated away into the emptiness. I told myself not to panic. Maybe she had gone to bed early. Maybe she'd had one of her dizzy spells and was lying down. Yet the unease inside me kept growing, crawling up my spine like a whisper that wouldn't stop. I could almost feel eyes on me, though there was no one around. Even the trees seemed still, their branches heavy and unmoving. The neighborhood that always felt so safe suddenly looked like a painting, too still, too perfect, too quiet. I took a step forward, my shoes crunching softly against the gravel. The sound startled me more than it should have. My heart gave a little jump. "You're just being silly, Me," I muttered to myself. "It's just the wind, just the dark." But when I looked up, I noticed something else. Her mailbox was open, the lid swinging back and forth with a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. And just for a split second I thought I saw movement behind her curtain. A shadow. Quick. Sharp, gone before I could blink. I felt a strange chill in my chest, the kind that makes your hands tremble and your voice catch in your throat. I wanted to go back inside, but at the same time something deep inside me wanted to know what was happening. I stood frozen between fear and curiosity, listening for any sound at all, footsteps, voices, even the meow of one of her cats. But the night refused to give me anything. Then I noticed the smell. Faint at first, almost unnoticeable, like a match that had been struck and quickly blown out. It wasn't perfume or candle smoke, it was sharper, heavier. My nose wrinkled as I tried to place it. Gas, that's what it was, just a hint of it drifting through the cool air. I looked toward her house again, the uneasy feeling in my stomach twisting tighter. I thought about running over there, knocking on her door, making sure she was all right, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of embarrassing myself, or maybe it was that old woman's instinct, the one that knows when danger is near. My grandmother used to say, "Me, if the night ever goes too quiet, it's because it's listening. And when the world listens, you hush and listen back." So I did. I stood there listening. And what I heard was nothing. Just the kind of nothing that stretches too far, like the world's holding its breath. Even the crickets had stopped singing. I remember glancing at my watch. 10 minutes had passed since I first read that note. 10 minutes of silence, 10 minutes of my heart begging me to do something, 10 minutes that would change everything. I looked down the street one more time. Every house was dark except for one light flickering at the very end, someone's old porch bulb struggling to stay alive. I remember thinking how fragile it looked, glowing all by itself in the darkness, and for some reason it made me think of Mrs. Henderson. Fragile, yes, but stubborn, always holding on, always watching out for others. Something deep in my chest tightened again. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been trying to tell me something she didn't have time to explain. I whispered her name again, but this time it sounded more like a prayer than a question. And in that heavy stillness, I could have sworn I felt a vibration under my feet, like the ground itself was giving me one last warning. I turned toward my door, the note still in my hand, and whispered to myself, maybe I should leave just for tonight. But before I could take a single step inside, I saw it, the faintest orange glow flickering behind her kitchen window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know it then, but the night had already started breaking. The quiet wasn't calm anymore, it was the pause before the storm, the breath before the scream. And in that eerie stillness, I realized something terrible was about to happen. It all happened so fast, and yet I remember every second like the ticking of a clock that refused to stop. One moment I was standing there staring at that faint orange glow behind Mrs. Henderson's kitchen window, and the next the whole world seemed to take a deep, trembling breath. The air grew heavier, almost humming, and then there was a sound, a low, hollow groan that rose from the ground beneath me. It was like the earth itself was warning me to run. Before I could even move, a blast of light burst through her windows. The sound came next, a deafening roar that ripped through the quiet night like thunder cracking open the sky. The force hit me hard, knocking the breath right out of my chest. I fell backward onto the porch, my teacup shattering beside me, my heart pounding so fast it hurt. For a moment I couldn't hear anything, just a ringing in my ears, sharp and endless. When I opened my eyes, all I could see was fire. Mrs. Henderson's house, that sweet little white house with blue shutters and rose bushes, was burning. Flames clawed at the roof, reaching higher and higher, turning the night into a storm of orange and black. The air smelled of gas and smoke and something else, something final. My throat burned as I coughed, trying to call her name, but all that came out was a broken whisper. Mrs. Henderson, I tried again, louder this time, though my voice cracked in the middle. The words disappeared into the roar of the fire. I stumbled to my feet, dizzy, half blinded by the smoke, and ran toward her yard. Every step felt heavier than the last. The ground was littered with debris, pieces of wood, shattered glass, the torn remains of her curtains floating down like ghosts. When I reached her front door, the heat was unbearable. The paint was bubbling, the metal handle glowing red. I covered my hands with my sweater and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The door groaned, jammed tight by the blast. My lungs screamed for air as I pounded on the wood, yelling her name again and again. "It's me, it's Auntie Mae, please answer me." Then came another explosion, smaller but closer. It blew open the side of the house, sending a wave of heat and smoke straight toward me. The force knocked me backward into the grass. For a second the world went white. I felt the earth spinning, my body heavy, my breath thin. Somewhere far off, I heard the sound of shattering glass and the shrill cry of a cat. I don't remember how long I lay there, staring up at the sky that glowed red from the flames. I only remember thinking that the note hadn't been a prank or a mistake. It had been a warning, a desperate, last-minute plea from a woman who knew she wouldn't make it out. My eyes filled with tears as I realized that she must have smelled the gas long before I did. She tried to warn me, to save me, even as danger crept closer to her own door. When the fire trucks finally arrived, their sirens tore through the night. The flashing red lights painted everything in bursts of chaos, smoke swirling like ghosts, firefighters shouting, neighbors gathering in frightened clusters. I tried to stand, but my legs trembled beneath me. One of the firefighters rushed to my side, asking if I was hurt, but all I could do was point at the burning house and whisper, "She's in there." They went in, brave men, faces covered in soot, fighting through the flames. I waited, my hands shaking, praying that somehow she'd come out coughing, crying, alive. But minutes passed, and when they finally emerged, their faces told me everything. One of them shook his head slowly. My heart cracked. I turned away, unable to look, the tears spilling freely now. The fire burned for what felt like hours. When it was finally out, there was nothing left but blackened wood, the skeleton of a home that once held laughter and kindness. The air was still heavy with smoke, and the faint smell of roses from her garden mixed with the scent of ash. I clutched the crumpled note in my hand, its edges singed from the heat, and whispered through my tears, "You saved me. You saved me, and I didn't even know." That night, standing in the glow of what was once my neighbor's home, I realized how fragile life truly is. 10 minutes. That's all it took for everything to change. 10 minutes between an ordinary evening and a nightmare, and in those 10 minutes a woman's courage became my salvation. Sometimes I still hear the echo of that explosion when I close my eyes, the rumble beneath my feet, the blinding light, the sound of the world tearing open. But more than that, I remember the warning, those shaky, desperate words written in trembling ink, "Get out of here if you want to live." And every time I think of them, I whisper her name and say a quiet thank you to the neighbor who gave her life so that I could keep mine. The morning after the fire, the world felt hollow. The street that had always been full of laughter and life now sat wrapped in silence. Ash still drifted lazily in the air, glowing faintly in the early light like snow that had lost its warmth. I stood on my porch in the same clothes I had worn the night before, the smell of smoke clinging to my sweater, and stared across at what used to be Mrs. Henderson's home. All that remained was a blackened shell. The blue shutters she painted every spring had melted into the siding, her white picket fence half buried beneath the debris. It didn't seem real. The firefighters had already come and gone. They told me she hadn't made it out. Their voices were gentle, careful, as if they were afraid the truth might break me in two. But I already knew. Deep down, I had known from the moment the explosion lit up the night sky. Still, hearing it said out loud made my knees weak. She had been the kind of woman who never asked for anything, who spent her days baking pies for the church and feeding stray cats that no one else would look at. And even in her final moments, she thought of everyone else before herself. Later that day, one of the fire marshals came by. His face was tired, streaked with soot. He carried a small box in his hands. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we found this in the remains of her kitchen. Thought it might belong to you." Inside the box was a scrap of paper burned along the edges, but the words were still there. The same shaky handwriting I'd seen the night before. Only this time there were more words beneath the warning. "Gas leak. Leave now, I'll try to stop it." My breath caught in my throat. She'd known. She had smelled the danger long before anyone else. She must have realized the leak was spreading, that there wasn't time to call for help. And instead of running, she tried to save everyone else first. That was who she was, the kind of woman whose first thought was never for herself. I pressed the paper against my chest and whispered her name, feeling the weight of her sacrifice sink deep into my soul. I learned later from the fire chief that she had gone door to door that night, knocking, warning whoever would answer. Most of the neighbors hadn't heard her asleep, televisions blaring, windows closed. She made it as far as my house, slipping the note under my door when I didn't hear her knock. After that, they said she must have gone back inside, maybe to try and turn off the valve or save one of her cats. I could picture her doing exactly that, even as the seconds ticked away. Brave, steady, thinking of others until the very end. I couldn't sleep for days after that. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows reminded me of that night. But somewhere between the grief and the guilt, a strange kind of peace began to grow. Because her last act hadn't been one of fear, it had been love. Fierce, quiet love. The kind that burns brighter than any fire. She didn't die running away, she died protecting. And that thought, painful as it was, gave me strength. The neighborhood came together to rebuild, but nothing ever filled the empty space where her house once stood. Children still avoid walking too close to that patch of ground. And yet whenever I pass by, I stop for a moment, close my eyes and imagine her standing there again, her hands in her gardening gloves, waving to me from her porch. I whisper, "Thank you," every single time. Some people think bravery is loud, soldiers charging into battle, heroes saving strangers on the news. But I've learned it can be something much quieter. It can be an old woman with trembling hands scribbling a note in the dark, risking everything to save her neighbor. Her bravery didn't roar, it whispered. It slipped under a door. It came in the shape of a few desperate words that changed my life forever. When I look at that piece of paper now, framed above my mantel, I see more than just a warning. I see a testament of courage, a reminder that kindness can live even in the face of death. And every time I read those words, "Get out of here if you want to live," I hear her voice, calm and steady, guiding me once more. Sometimes, late at night, I light a candle for her. The flame dances softly, gentle but firm, and I think about how one act of love can echo long after the person who gave it is gone. Mrs. Henderson may have left this world in fire, but she lives on in the life she saved in me. And as long as I breathe, I'll carry her story, her courage, and her selfless warning in my heart.